Hello and welcome to the AUA Focus Series, a podcast channel of the AUA Media Lab. I'm Alina Gharabegian, Provost here at AUA, and today I have a very special guest with me, Scott Setrakian, who is among his many other accomplishments, is the president of the William Saroyan Foundation. Scott, welcome.
It's great to be here, Alina. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Scott has served as executive producer of the feature film Ithaca, based on William Saroyan's beloved novel, The Human Comedy, and directed by Meg Ryan. He is a Stanford-trained entrepreneur, investor, and advisor whose career spans co-founding and scaling major analytics and AI firms, serving on prominent boards, and pursuing eclectic ventures from patents to tournament backgammon. Thanks so much for being here with us today. The William Saroyan Foundation is the organization dedicated to preserving and advancing the legacy of one of America's most original voices, William Saroyan. The foundation is also the driving force behind the Saroyan Days festival, which has enjoyed a week-long presence here in Yerevan with various cultural events. Scott, would you tell us a little bit about the foundation, please, and also a little bit about the festivities in the Saroyan Days?
Of course. So William Saroyan himself founded the William Saroyan Foundation in 1966, and he viewed it as a vehicle for ultimately, extending his legacy after he died. He placed all of his literary and artistic assets into the foundation, so that they could all be managed in a cohesive and organized way. And when he died, he left my father, Robert Setrakian, in charge of it. And he died in 1981, so it's been over 40 years now that the foundation has been both addressing that mission, that is, in sort of extending the legacy of William Saroyan, through both specific programs like Saroyan Days and also through kind of the administrative tasks of approving production rights or publication rights or whatever for Saroyan's work. And also in supporting a wide variety of charities that we feel are aligned with what Saroyan stood for. One of them, as you know, is AUA. And so we are driving down two paths. One is supporting education and Armenian causes, and the other is working in support of Saroyan's legacy. Saroyan Days is very much aligned with that second goal, propelling Saroyan's legacy. And for the last week here in Armenia, we have been hosting a wide variety of events in partnership with a wide variety of Armenian institutions to sort of introduce, especially to a younger generation of Armenians, the wide variety of different artistic voices that Saroyan had. So, for example, we have just opened at the Museum of Literature and Art an art show of Saroyan's paintings and drawings, over 100. It's little known that he was an extraordinarily talented artist, and the paintings are sensational. It's a really great show. We have released a book in Armenian of 22 short stories that Saroyan wrote that have never been published in any language before in history. So brand new work for the Armenian audience. There has been a play that was produced by the Malayan Theater. There was an evening at the Yerevan State Institute of Theater and Film where we both had stage presentations as well as the sort of early rush look at a film that's being made by a couple of young filmmakers of Saroyan's short story, The Summer of the Beautiful White Horse. It is a claymation feature, and it is super cool. I can't wait for it to be done. Last night there was an event yesterday at the National Library of Armenia that focused on a kind of a more academic approach, but it focused on Saroyan's work in Armenian, which of course is generally translated work. He spoke Armenian, but he didn't write in Armenian. And then we had a very nice gathering here also yesterday where a number of people read from Saroyan's works. And yesterday, last night, we had an event hosted at HEBU headquarters and produced in partnership with Creative Armenia, where a number of young Armenian artists talked about Saroyan's inspiration and relevance in literature, in stagecraft, in cinema, and also in artwork. So we've been trying to celebrate the wide variety of Saroyan's talents.
Wonderful. We certainly enjoyed the night of readings.
That was fun.
That was very, very inspirational, and we're very grateful to you for including us in the festivities. Your family's relationship with Saroyan was deeply personal, right? With your father, as you said, Robert, as both friend and estate steward. Growing up with these stories, how did they shape your vision of the foundation's mission?
It certainly started when my father was made the executor, and I should tell you, he was very surprised that came about. He had not been expecting it at all, and the estate was. Just to back up for a second, actually, as a young man, I had the opportunity of staying in Saroyan's apartment in Paris for 2 weeks. He wasn't there. My brother and I were there, and it was.
What year was this?
This was probably 1977, I would guess. And the place was, in a somewhat weirdly orderly way, the most disorderly place you've ever seen. There were stacks of papers all over the place. There were rocks all over the place. And Saroyan's estate was left in kind of a similar organized but completely disorganized fashion. And so my first impression of the Saroyan Foundation was watching my father trying to collect and systematize, especially written work that was in Paris, Fresno, San Francisco, Fresno had 2 houses in Fresno, by the way, San Francisco and Beverly Hills, completely disorganized, and bringing all of that together and trying to bring some organization to it. And there were a number of academics that had various views of how that should best be done, and it was a very complicated and time-consuming project for him. So my first observation of the foundation was, oh my God, it's a huge amount of work, and somewhat thankless. But he was able to bring that all together in a very well organized way. Ultimately, it all was placed at Stanford University, and so the kind of the focus of the foundation moved from just trying to get all this stuff organized now to helping to support, get it out to people that want to either produce it or research it. And ultimately, over the last couple of years, in my case, researching it myself and trying to find this unpublished work that we've now brought forward into this book.
Wonderful. What is the relationship with Stanford?
Stanford Libraries is now the sole holder of the Saroyan written estate, the William Saroyan. I guess it's the William Saroyan Papers is what they call it. They have very carefully, systematically cataloged all of it. It is a massive, massive amount of paper. It is everything from his written work that was meant to be short stories and poems and stage, and plays and movies, but it is also a wide variety of letters, scraps of paper that he doodled on. It's a lot of stuff. We have worked together with Stanford now since 2003, hosting and giving out a novel or long book, fiction and nonfiction book award, the William Saroyan International Prize for Writing, that has awarded some really sensational books. It gets fabulous entries. I've been a judge in the last couple cycles, which has been really rewarding. But so that's also sort of kept Saroyan's place alive in partnership with Stanford. And Stanford now administrates all of the requests for publication, production and so forth.
Okay, wonderful. Great. The 22 previously unpublished short stories that you've just published, was there anything that struck you among those as particularly surprising or very meaningful? Do you have a favorite story?
Couple things. One, the stories span his entire writing career from 1934, when he published his very first important short story, all the way to the late 1970s, shortly before he died. And you can absolutely track the evolution of his style, and also get some insights into how these stories reflected what he was going through at the time. The reason one can do that is that in addition to being such a prodigious writer of prose, he was also a very attentive journalist, and he kept a journal nearly every single day of his life, sometimes in great detail of what he was doing moment to moment to moment. So you're able to see for certain of the stories specifically what he was thinking about when he wrote them. And there are 3 stories that turn out to be kind of my favorite, not necessarily exactly because of what's in them, but because of how they were written. This was in 1965. He had had a very frustrating and unsuccessful to his measure year. And on November 30th, in his journal, he called himself the writing machine. He said, I am going to write one short story a day, every day from now to January 1, 1966, 33 stories, and that is going to save this year. And he said, I'm going to go on and do other stuff, but I'm going to get up every morning and write the story. And for the next 4 days, he did that. And the 5th day, his journal starts with, I just couldn't do it. I just didn't feel like it. It's such a nice day. But 3 of those 4 stories are in the book, and they're great. And one in particular is especially amusing. It is the great Saroyan imagination. It is about a tailor in Fresno who, with the help of his assistant, who is a former high school valedictorian, writes an advertisement that appears in the local Fresno paper. And it lists, I believe it's like 27 reasons why he's got the best tailor shop in Fresno and why people should come to him. And one of the reasons he writes out infuriates the Fresno Armenian community. And the story evolves to this confrontation of leaders of various types coming in all together to demand to understand why he had written that in the advertisement. And that plus kind of the hijinks that then ensue are hilarious. It's a really great story.
That's great.
Yeah.
Good. That's what clearly I haven't read it. And so
yeah. It's called Buck B.
Okay, that's the Buck B story. Mm-hmm. Okay, keep that in mind. You just talked about Fresno. So Saroyan has an identity as an Armenian, as an American, as very sort of squarely Californian, and maybe Fresnan. How do you talk about his identity when you go to present him to audiences? What is your conception of his identity?
Yeah, that's a good question. He himself communicated ambiguity about his identity in some ways and not in others. He was decidedly an Armenian, no matter what, and he was decidedly an American too. But there's also ambiguity in that, right?
Sure.
And he talked kind of obliquely about I tried to forget Armenia, but I never could. He didn't visit Armenia until he was until 1935, I believe it was, when he was probably 27 years old. But he grew up speaking Armenian. His parents were very freshly immigrated from Beatles. I'm not very good at characterizing his kind of amalgam of ethnicities, and so I don't much. I had an interesting meeting about a year ago here in Yerevan with the CEO of Antares, the publication house, and he wrote me after that, and he said, I was really confused when I met you at first because of your last name. I thought you're Armenian. I don't even speak Armenian. And then he said, but I got that, and so I figured out you were an American. But then I thought about the things we talked about, and I realized that I don't quite know what you are, but you're a really good advocate for William Saroyan. And I kind of feel the same way about Saroyan. I'm not quite sure how to describe how he would describe himself other than to assure you that he would have as a top definitive priority that he's Armenian.
That's very interesting. What aspects do you think he would highlight in calling himself Armenian?
I think both a highly emotional connection to the history of the people of Armenia and also a list that he would make of what he perceives as specific Armenian characteristics that he also has. Somebody described him as somewhat a genius primitive, and I think that he would find some agreement with that phrase and attach that to his Armenianism a little bit. He was loud, he was profane, he was argumentative and hilarious, and would attribute, I think, many of those characteristics to his Armenian.
Intense.
He was intense.
Very Armenian.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
His style is deceptively plain, childlike sometimes, but complex, also emotionally complex. Bits and pieces remind me of William Blake's Songs of Innocence and Experience. Do you think this was very deliberate, or do you think it was part of his humanistic spirit that came through in his writing?
So Saroyan quit school when he was young, I don't know, before he was 16. But he educated himself in the Fresno libraries and was a voracious reader of literature of all types. And I found in the archives some letters that he wrote in his very early 20s to a woman who was a magazine editor in Montana, which is a northern state, as you know, in the United States, out in the middle of nowhere. And these letters were extraordinarily literate and thoughtful, and they talked about, the sort of aspects of Russian literature and aspects of French literature from a very academic and knowledgeable point of view. This was not – I'm saying all this because what I don't think it was just Saroyan being himself, and that's just the way it came out. I think that it was more than just a natural exposition that everybody seemed to like very much. I think that it was thoughtful, crafted. Exactly.
That's interesting. You just referenced academics. Are there common misperceptions, misreadings that scholars, academics have of Saroyan?
I will tell you that critically, he was absolutely embraced starting in the mid-1930s all the way until the late 1940s. And his writing was very much about the dignity of people who were struggling, immigrants, people who were poor, the humor that they found in being alive, and the kind of generosity of the human spirit. A philosophy and theme that he continued in his writing through the 1950s, for example. However, after the United States, quote unquote, won World War II and became the most powerful country in the world by many measures, the style and what I think American readers were looking for, and the writers that became much more popular during that period, were very muscular. Norman Mailer, the late days of Ernest Hemingway. And about how great the United States is and the American people. And Saroyan's style, which remained the same, but had found itself sort of out of step, and critics criticized it for not evolving and for being kind of redundant, and who really cares anymore. And when you ask me about misconceptions of academics or critics, I think it's always within the context of the times, right? I mean, the writing was the same. It was more, he didn't change, they changed.
Yeah. Perception is a fluid thing.
Right. And I don't have the background or education to be able to comment with authority about how any academics are right or wrong about his writing.
Okay. Fair enough. Yeah. And of course, that critical reception is going to change, exactly as you're saying, from decade to decade, from current to current, and so on. And
it did during his, basically there was a kind of a redefinition by the critics of his writing in the 1970s.
Of course.
When he was sort of rediscovered, and everybody appreciated him again. It was pretty interesting.
Yeah, you see that with all kinds of writers, over and
I'm hoping that's going to happen in my life at some point.
I'm sure it doesn't need to.
I'd be surprised.
On a personal note, is there a line, a fragment, maybe a story that is particularly moving to you, or profoundly meaningful as a custodian of his legacy and as a reader, or as a reader?
It's like, what do you like? What
do you like about Saroyan?
I've recently reread two stories that are really great. One was the pomegranate tree. And I was trying, by the way, to, in the case of the pomegranate trees, I was trying to find a metaphor that I was going to use to describe what's happened with the Saroyan Days. And it's not a good metaphor, but it's a great story. A story of a man and his nephew who are trying to plant a pomegranate orchard on very rocky ground down in the Central Valley. And their trials and tribulations and ultimate unfortunate failure to do it, but the kind of very heartwarming byplay of their work together in trying to make it happen. It is a sensational story. And a second I read, there is a very nice lady who has recently purchased a painting of William Saroyan's, who's of Assyrian background. And I went and sought out and reread his famous story, I believe it's 10,000 Assyrians. And it is a little bit of a metaphor for what has occurred with the Armenian race in the was set in 1930s, but focused on Assyrians whose population globally was down to about 10,000. And they're in San Francisco in the depths of poverty. And he's I don't know, ends up in a barber shop talking to a barber. And it is a fascinating, really compelling, and as you said earlier, so simple the story is, and yet really thought-provoking. And, yeah.
Absolutely. Our students are junior scholars. Many of them know Saroyan through My Name is Aram, or through highly anthologized pieces, if they know him at all, here in Yerevan. Are there lesser-known stories among those 22 that you would recommend to them?
Well, all of the 22 are lesser known because they've never been published before. I don't know which one of those is lesser known than the rest. I would suggest two things. One is his very first book was called The Daring Young Man on the Flying Trapeze, and it was famously a book of 28 short stories that he wrote in 26 days, he says, which I don't think is true, but nonetheless. And they were considered in the day to be experimental, and they formed the kind of original explosive energy that started his career running, and there's some really good stuff in it. I think that the 22 stories are great and kind of a fun way to look at his work across his entire career. When you know a little more about it, and I'll tell a little more about it right now, there are a couple stories that I think are especially interesting. One of them, in 1949, Saroyan's career was beginning to crest, and he had personal problems, including a very, very deep gambling problem. His marriage was in trouble. His popularity was waning. And 1949 was the first of about 10 years when his life just blasted apart. And this story, which is called A Little Something or Other in the book, is set in that period when it's just starting off, and you can just see him foreshadowing what's going to be happening. And it's a combination of he's low on money. He has his family with him. He really wants to bet on his one racehorse. He wants to make sure he has enough money to be able to get his family home. They're visiting Fresno. They live in San Francisco, and he needs money to get home. And he is confronted while he's in Fresno by a tailor who had made a coat for his father right before his father died, and that his father hadn't paid for. So he now has yet another call on his money, and he's sort of wrestling through family obligations, his intense desire to bet on his horse, and sort of weighing out how to manage all of that in front of his family so that they still respect him. And it's, with that background, a very interesting story. One of my very favorites in the book. And you asked about two, I believe. Let me think for a second. Well, we heard when we were here together, we heard a reading of about 1/7 of a book called Various Prayers.
Yes. Oh, I loved that
a story called Various Prayers.
That was great.
And this is set in Fresno, in a church in Fresno, where the minister stands up and says, as it is usual, we will call on one parishioner to make a prayer, and then we'll have a song, and then we'll have another parishioner. And this one parishioner stands up and ends up speaking for about an hour and a half with what I will simply tell you is the most hilarious prayer you've ever heard in your life. It weaves around the Armenian experience in California. It weaves around his own experience wanting to ask God for stuff, but not really wanting to ask God for it. It weaves through his friends, his family, history, his deprioritization of shoe shining. Mm-hmm. It's great. It's really funny.
Yes, it is.
It's really
It was
funny.
probably my favorite of the readings.
Yeah.
He's a complex character as a man, as a human being. And some of that complexity owes itself to maybe some ethical ambiguity in him. Would that be fair?
Help me with that phrase, just so I can be.
So he's human, right? He has flaws,
yeah.
As all of us do.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe this is not a very fair question, but is there an ethics that comes out in his writing that you could describe?
First of all, I think that many observers of Saroyan would say that he is more flawed than most of us. But he was very open about some of his weaknesses, certainly about his gambling and about his drinking and his inability to hold very close relationships for a very long time. His writing, however, I think is often highly principled and very aspirational with regards to the way people treat one another and how important, big L, love is in sort of keeping us all together. And in that sense, there was a bit of a contrast, right, between the writing and the way the man lived his life, for sure. Yeah. There's no doubt about that.
But that's what makes him so interesting.
Not just interesting, but yeah, and
yes,
and
the
that there is
complexity.
There's this guy in there who's just this wonderful, wonderful man.
Yeah, that's great. Looking to the horizon, is there a project you want to bring to life in the next couple of years through the foundation with some Armenian institutions,
I've been
including
working on.
AUA?
Yeah, I'd love to. Yeah. So the other day, somebody asked me, "So what are we going to do next year for Saroyan Days?"
Yes, exactly.
And one of my friends at the embassy said, "That's sort of like asking." I, by the way, rejected this metaphor or simile. He said, "That's sort of like asking a woman who is right in the middle of labor if she wants to have another child." My answer was, "It's too soon, man. This has really been fun. And I want to take a little breath once it's over."
Sure, it's a lot of work.
There have been some really fabulous friendships and connections made here, including one with AUA. And I think there's a lot to build on so that we could do something even better next time. So, once the kind of smoke clears off of this one, we'll be in touch and see what we can think about.
When the labor pains are over.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
that's great. Okay. So, Scott, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me, Alina. It's really great being here.
It's been really wonderful, not just today, but also the other night, the readings. You totally inspired the entire community. Everyone walked away with that, with a glow.
Yeah, really fun.
And you were extremely generous with your time. So we thank you very, very much.
It's my pleasure, and I mean that for sure.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And thank you to our audience, to our listeners for joining us in today's conversation. Thank you.